excellent representative. Our next speaker, our main speaker tonight, is someone that I've got to know over a few years, and certainly in growing appreciation of his talents and his wonderful personality. There are people, I think many people in this audience, who know what I'm talking about, and that's why you've come here. All the way from Thornhill, all the way from Scarborough, wherever you've chosen to come to hear Reverend Jonah Evans, and it was a wise choice to come here tonight. I'll call you Jonah, I always do, thank you. Jonah was born in California and came across Anthroposophy as a young child in the Waldorf schools. So a few of us have had that pleasure, not myself, but to have that kind of upbringing is a wonderful start in the world. Makes a chance for a whole human being to evolve, and that's certainly been the case. Jonah went to university, studied psychology like so many of us, trying to figure out what it is we actually want to do, and then moved on to become a priest in the Christian Community Church, and a very successful priest. We're thrilled to have him in the Thornhill Church. In case there are people, probably many of you, who are wondering about the confluence between church and anthroposophy, it's certainly not necessary for an anthroposophist to be a member of the Christian Community Church, but I think, in my experience, some of the best anthroposophists are Christian community priests, and Jonah is certainly an excellent example of that. So excellent that he's been recognized continent-wide. We now have in the Toronto area the seminary for all of North America, because this is where Jonah works. And so he's the co-director now of the newly moved seminary for the formation of Christian community priests for all of North America. I'm quite impressed with that accomplishment for such a young man. Jonah is an excellent speaker, as I'm sure so many of you know, and I'm quite thrilled to have him here to speak with us tonight. Thanks very much, Jonah. Welcome.
Can you hear me? Is it echoey? Good. Well, I too concur. That was one of the best introductions to anthroposophy that I've also heard, maybe ever. Thank you, Robert. That was very beautiful. And thank you for that introduction, Grant. I don't know, it feels, yeah, too big somehow, but we'll see how we go here. And I'm so grateful to see all of you, your faces here. Some of you I know very well, and it's nice to feel your beaming face coming towards me. And some of you I've never met, and that's also really good to see some new faces. As I was walking here, we went to the library, and all of a sudden, at my feet, I stopped, and there was a little piece of writing on the cement. Guerrilla self-care. Somebody had done some random art. It says guerrilla self-care, and above it, it said, "You are loved." You are loved. Right here at the university. A piece of art. And that is meant to be self-care, to read that sentence as you walk into the library. I was quite moved. Maybe, in a way, you could say the whole talk tonight is contained in that little sentence. Robert mentioned one of the meanings of anthroposophy is, or one of the understandings of what it is something that tries to connect the spiritual in me, or the spiritual in you, with the spiritual in the universe. or the spiritual element in the world. And in a way, that's what I'd like to talk about, 3 different aspects of that practice, truth, reality. From the perspective of 3, I would say, more and more universal problems of the human soul. The first being, more and more human beings are struggling to find meaning in life. I just had an experience where a woman came off the street into the church, and she was deeply upset. And we went into the consultation room, and she just said, I don't know what to do with my life anymore. I can't, it doesn't mean anything. What am I doing? Help me. Some of you may have heard that there's also quite an epidemic of young men killing themselves, particularly in the States. How do we find meaning today? Also in a culture that's more and more consumed with consumerism, that seems to be also leading to more and more, what's the point if I get all this stuff and then I die? So that's the first challenge, meaninglessness. Or, put in another way, I want to look at how Anthroposophy and spiritual science shows us how meaning is created, or how meaning is gifted to the human soul, to the human heart. The other challenge today, which anybody who works, Grant maybe not, he's nice and retired. Anybody who works, maybe any students, know this phenomena of burnout. It's becoming quite the thing. My wife, who works at a Waldorf school, also has told me that many of the teachers there are struggling with burnout, feeling at the edge of their forces constantly every day. My colleagues too, we often talk about how can we improve our ways of working where we're feeling we're leading congregations on empty. So the question there becomes, where is the source of vitality in the world, in the universe, that I can orientate myself, my heart, to? How can spiritual science help us see how we can be gifted with sources of real vitality in order to battle the reality of burnout? Just think of screens. Screens are more and more a necessity in our lives, and actually screens drain our life forces. So the human being today needs to renew or find, or both, ways to feel gifted by real life, vitality. And spiritual science can also show us that way. And the final challenge is related to the whole culture of untruth today. Untruthfulness. Most academic settings, while there are many, many gifts, of course, also work with the idea that truth is not really real. It's something relative. I heard a politician the other day, maybe a year ago, actually. I think his last name is Giuliani. He said, truth is not truth. That's also something we are constantly hearing more and more in the political sphere, that there is no truth. It's whatever you feel or persuade. But anthroposophy, spiritual science, can also show us ways to find sources of truth, sources of experiential truth, that are not just ideas that are true in all cases, but truth that actually changes our hearts, makes us better people, makes us better humans in the world. So 3 gifts. It said overcoming meaninglessness, burnout, and untruth. But actually what I really want to talk about is how to cultivate a connection with these 3 gifts. The gift of meaning in our lives, the gift of vitality, and the gift of truth. So let's start with the gift of meaning. How is meaning cultivated? How does it come alive in the human heart? And I want to talk about it from a certain perspective, particularly about how it comes to us in our destiny, in our life. And Rudolf Steiner talks about a certain principle, a certain experience that we can have, and I would invite you now to try to touch into that. Whoever would like to, please shut your eyes and imagine or think back or think to when was the time in your life where you grew as a person the most, where you took real steps in your character the most. Okay. Now, if you've found something, if the time kind of came to you, raise your hand if that time in your life was difficult. Most everyone? Most everyone raised their hand, some didn't. But this little experiential experience can tell us that most of the time where we actually grow the most is when something comes into our life that is a crisis, a challenge, challenging us to grow. Now, there are some that maybe grew through not such a difficult time. That's also possible. I remember when my first child was born, Milena. It was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, and I definitely grew in my capacity to experience love in that moment. But that's also possible, to grow through wonderful experiences. But mostly, the human heart grows through challenge, crisis. Now, try to feel, this is the next part, try to feel that part of yourself that knew it needed that to grow. Is that possible? Try to feel a part of yourself that actually knew, that's wiser than the one that's awake right now, that knew that was important for you to encounter so that you could become more of yourself. that part of your being, Rudolf Steiner calls the wiser one in us, or the higher self. The wiser one in us. And it actually knows from pre-birth what challenges we need to experience in order to become more of who we are. And he says something even more radical. He says, and that higher being in you that's not in you, that's actually in your guardian angel in the spiritual world, that higher one, that wiser one, actually sends us the challenges. Our own higher being sends it. So I picture here the human heart, which contains another part of ourself, which we'll talk about in a second. But this higher one we could picture as a star above us, our star, that normally we're not so conscious of. But Rudolf Steiner said this wiser one actually sends us he even calls it a magic power, or a magic power attracts us to these challenges so that we can become more of who we are. Now, there's another part of yourself, and it's more in here. And that part of yourself, now try to feel, it never wants pain. Would never choose pain or struggle. Just wants to be on the couch. No, on the couch. Yeah? Can you feel that? There's another part of myself that I don't want all those problems. I just want to coast. That part of ourself is more of our everyday self. It's more of what we're conscious of. And the wiser one in us sends us our challenges, and the free one, this is also the free one, has to, or is challenged to, or is asked to by its own higher being, to integrate those challenges and to find the golden nugget in the ore, to make the coal into the diamond. The everyday self in us has to learn how to transform, what to let go of, how to grow in order to meet this higher self that wants to come into being here in the world. And I want to give you a couple of real-life stories that illustrate this gift. So this gift comes from our higher being to our lower being, and our challenge is in freedom to integrate it, meaning to become more of who we are. I had a congregant friend in Spring Valley. Her name was Amelia. Now, many of you who know me know this story, so you just have to be patient. Amelia was a dear soul. And she cared for the elderly, and she did it with such devotion. But one day, at one point, she was diagnosed with cancer. And right away, she began to do everything in her power to cure herself. She started eating macrobiotically. She started eating only biodynamic foods, organic. She read all the right books. She meditated. She prayed. She came to the Mass, our Eucharist service, every chance she got. Everything right. And then about 2 weeks before she crossed the threshold of death, I came to her bedside, and she was already not able to get up. And she said to me, she said, Jonah, I've done everything right. Why do I still have cancer? And I didn't know, and so I sat there silently for a few moments, also asking myself, why? And then, in a moment, it just, this picture answer came to me. And I said, sometimes the illness doesn't want to be changed by us, but the illness wants to mold us, change us with its presence. And for her, that moment, that was exactly what she needed. Somehow for her, that truth allowed her or invited her to let go of an old conception that she was carrying, that was burdening her. And that is, if I do good, I get rewarded. If I do everything perfectly, I'll get the reward of health. That was actually something she had to let go of, or was called to let go of. And it brought her deep peace that she carried through the threshold. So this is an example of something that her higher being, that's a radical thing, that her own higher being brought her, this illness, in order to help her awaken to a deeper understanding of karma and a deeper experience of true peace. In that moment, in a way, her soul spirit was super healthy, even though her body was ill. The awakened, gifted heart. And a heart that has found a new meaning for life, even though she only lived 2 weeks. This shows the aspect of our wiser one that brings us lessons, brings us wisdom, brings us more of our self to us. But it doesn't just happen automatically. We have to transform freely. Another example is a story that actually another priest, a colleague, brought, I think, to Hesperus at one evening. It's a story of a man named Bill Griffin. This is another story of how meaning is gifted and generated by this wiser one in co-creation with this everyday self. And Bill Griffin also got sick, and he was more and more paralyzed to the point where he could barely talk. And he went to the doctor, and he said to the doctor, "Look, I don't want to live anymore. I'm clearly not going to I'm going to be a prisoner in my own body at a certain point, and I want you to help me to kill myself." And the doctor, like good doctors do, they are also full of the spirit in the right moments, usually. And he said, "No, you will be able to listen to people. You won't have any of your faculties, but you can listen to people." And the Spirit was speaking through this doctor, and Bill heard these words, "I could listen to people." And so he actually took this up. He decided to let go of his self-pity and his will that his life was over because he couldn't move anymore, and unite with this new meaning for life that came through this doctor, you could listen to people. And he started inviting people to come. And at a certain point, he could really only move his pinky, I guess. And people started to come, and they would just express their, in private, they would just express their heartmost intimate secrets. And more people started to come, and he was super popular as the listening man, even though he couldn't talk, he could only move his. So another example of how meaning comes through a kind of transformative experience of letting go of the old and becoming something new, schooled by the crisis that your higher being brings your own self. Final example of the gift of meaning comes from another good friend, another story of illness. It's often, I would say maybe Dr. McAllister would agree with me, I'm not sure, but illness more and more, I think in our time is becoming an initiation process. But there's a good friend of mine in Spring Valley, Ralph Johnson, who also had cancer. And his was strange because it was cancer of the bowel. And this was a man you would never think was sick. He was the picture of health. He was super fit. He owned 5 health food stores in Connecticut. He took all the remedies and medicine. He ate perfectly all his life. And he got this cancer. And he told me, we were quite close, he told me that one night he was in the depths of depression because of the absurdity of this. He thought, me, someone who has been dedicated to health my whole life, I've got cancer? And he couldn't get over this absurd quality. And he was very angry as well. And in a kind of desperate moment then, he described to me, because he wrote journals. He wrote journals, and he shared them with me. He described that in a desperate moment, he then kind of called out. He was a Buddhist, didn't necessarily believe in God, but he called out for help. And he described a moment for him when, in this kind of darkness of despair, a presence came close to him. And this presence touched him here and then embraced him, he described, around his head. And he felt an overwhelming love come into his heart from this being. And he said, this love, he said, I never felt anything like this love before. He said, it felt like I had come home. And he said, I'd been looking for this home for my whole life, I realized in that moment. And the next day he called me and he told me, you know, I had this experience, and he told me all about it. And he said, Jonah, I know this is why I got cancer. To have this experience, to something to finally break me open. So for the rest of his 6 months of life, he then lived for this love. He wanted only to try to cultivate it and give it to people that he experienced. So through, again, another example of through finding the gift in the crisis from our higher being. Finding the gift by struggling freely with our own assumptions and boxes we've placed life in ourselves in and others in, trying to let go of that and transform and receive the gift from our higher self. We not only learn lessons, but we become more and more of our true being, because this is our higher being coming toward us, too. And thirdly, it's possible. This is one of the main teachings of spiritual science. It's possible to get closer and closer to what my friend Ralph called the being of love in life. Now, this is very different than some of the popular forms of spirituality that we find today. And I just want to mention that, just the distinction. For example, many of you may have heard about the law of attraction or something like that. Yeah? Anybody heard of the law of attraction? Yeah? This is a very different picture than what we'll find in most kind of popular spiritual New Age bookstores about the law of attraction. This is saying, the law of attraction says, you think of something positive here, and you'll attract positive things to you. But this is something almost completely opposite. It's saying, actually, when something difficult comes to you, it's not because you're not attracting your higher divinity. It's because you're attracting your higher divinity. The exact opposite. The true law of attraction, according to spiritual science, is that actually we attract difficulties from our higher being, not because we're not connected to our higher being, which is what more of the New Age says. And that we find actually more and more of the divine in the muck, in the mud, in life. That's where our divinity is. It's not so much transcending life. That's a very important thing to just be aware of. And we'll have questions at the end, so I hope we get time. That's the most exciting thing for me. I want to hear who's here, new people, cool. What do you guys think? Good, so let's go on. 7:45. Nice, we still have lots of time. Maybe just one more thing to tie in a couple of other deep thinkers. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the great philosopher, said, if I have the right why, I can bear any how. If I find the right why, meaning I can bear any circumstance in life. So that also points to the importance of cultivating meaning in our life so that we can bear life. But it also points to the next challenge, which is to find vitality. How do we find sources of vitality? And one source is meaning. When you feel your life is meaningful, you want to get up. You want to meet it. Another important point comes from Viktor Frankl, and that is we are not victims of meaning. We don't have to just, meaning doesn't just have to happen to us, but we can cultivate it. We can transform. We have agency in meaning. Viktor Frankl says it's our last freedom. No matter what happens, we can always change how we see and work with a circumstance. And that very much connects to to the spirit of Anthroposophy. Vitality, the gift of vitality. How do we find energy for life? Meaning, yes. But to one obvious place, where do you feel, after what do you feel the most energy from? Sleep. Sleep is one of the most important sources of vitality, and I would dare say that the quality of sleep is being compromised today. And that has to do with the fact that most of us go to bed with our phones, screens, and that kind of light keeps us awake, drains us. Sleep is more and more also compromised with the electromagnetic stuff going on. But sleep is one of the most important, as you know, from everyone's experience, most important sources of vitality. And it has a twofold quality. It gives life to our physical body through the fact that our spirit and soul go. So our physical body actually, from a spiritual scientific point of view, is drained by carrying our spirit consciousness and our soul. Consciousness actually erodes the life forces in our body. This is a truth from spiritual science. And we can feel that if we have to be awake and conscious for too long, our body starts to get drained. And so at night, spiritual science tells us our spirit and our soul must leave the body, go into the spiritual world, find new sources of energy from our angel, from the spiritual world. And at the same time, our body gets to hang out with our life forces. Have you ever seen someone who's asleep that looks so innocent and full of, life somehow? Their breathing is different. Especially a child looks so sweet when their personality isn't causing havoc everywhere. I have 3 little daughters. But this is the interesting thing, that our body actually gets rejuvenated by not being in the presence of our spirit. But our spirit gets rejuvenated by being in the presence of other spirits. So having quality sleep also, where you're not just dreaming, but you're actually entering the deeper levels of sleep, that means you're in the spiritual world. The rapid eye, where you're dreaming, it's kind of like in the in-between. So it's not as health-bringing, vitalizing to your spirit. So finding and cultivating the sacredness of sleep, going to bed at the same time, really trying to go to bed so you're it's not staying up past midnight. Some of my friends I'm speaking to. This is a really important way to keep the tanks filled. Another extremely important truth in the realm of spiritual science is that the meditative path, entering consciously now, when we go to sleep we're mostly unconscious, but now entering consciously into the spiritual world is another way to be able to have agency over a source of energy. And learning how to meditate properly, where my dear friend Kenneth said, I need meditation like I need food and water, where you can feel actually it's a life need. That's when you know you're actually receiving vitality from your meditative practice. And so, in a nutshell, meditation, spiritual science, what is it? For spiritual science, you could say that the spiritual world is made up of thoughts, divine thoughts, images, also feelings, will impulses, forces. And ultimately, the spiritual world is made up of beings. Beings, spiritual beings at different levels of consciousness. And Rudolf Steiner calls these three levels of the spiritual world imagination, inspiration, intuition. Imagination is the layer of the spiritual world that is made up of thoughts and images. Actually comes to us as thought image. Inspiration is the level of the spiritual world that is full of impulses and feelings and life and forces that come from spiritual beings at different levels of consciousness. That level is called intuition. And the human self in anthroposophical meditation tries to enter these different levels through practice and effort of the spiritual world. And it's at mostly this level, inspiration, where if we enter it, or if we start to feel something in our meditation, that's not just our personal feeling, our personal emotion, but actually we have the feeling it's coming out of the spiritual world and entering our heart. That's where meditation starts to become a source of life for us. Where it's not just a difficult exercise that I have to do again and again, but it's actually a source of life that we can, when we're tired or burnt out, we can go sit, open up to it, and receive new forces for life. But that takes practice. It takes a lot of effort and practice to learn to find and get to those places. It also takes a gift. Because you see, this world is made up of actually spiritual beings that are thinking certain thoughts, carrying certain images, feeling certain feelings and impulses. And that's when I get close to those beings, they actually gift me, in truth. All spiritual revelation and knowledge is a gift. They gift me with these things. I have to make myself ready, but I also can't force these things. So that's another form of the gifted heart, is in meditation, when we actually are able to come into the presence of beings that gift us with their substance. So sleep, go to bed early, get a nice bed, get your pillow together, don't watch too much YouTube. And meditate. But learn to get beyond just struggling to have the image in front of you. Struggling to work out because Steiner's meditations are not easy. Practice so that you can start to enter some of these realms where life is given, vitality is given. So would you like, now I talked to Lois. Lois called me. Anybody know Lois here? She's right there. Lois called me and said, so, what are you talking about? I gotta talk you up, buddy. And she said, you might want to do a spiritual exercise with people. I said, oh, there's no time for that kind of thing. But then I thought about it, and she might be right. So I want to do a little example. We still have time, right, Robert? Here, I want to share with you an example of one of Rudolf Steiner's meditative exercises. And if you ever are in lack of meditative exercises, this volume is all meditative exercises from Rudolf Steiner. 500 pages. But this one is particularly interesting also in the context of this wiser one in us. So, if you're willing, it has to do with focusing on certain thoughts that I'll read, and then doing an imagination, drawing a star in your being, yeah, that you do with your eyes closed. So I want to invite you to do this together as an example of something of what Rudolf Steiner calls meditative exercises. And with this, we're trying to touch in on this level here, imaginative inspiration. By focusing on certain thoughts. So let's try it. So if you would, close your eyes. And concentrate on the thought. Everything that happens around me, and everything that happens to me is necessary. Everything that happens around me and everything that happens to me is necessary. And then try to feel your eyes. And with that feeling, focus on, I will regard everything around me in this way. I will regard everything around me in this way. Now, try to move with your feeling into the heart and the arms and the hands. And think the thought, I will do in this way everything that should be done by me. I will do in this way everything that should be done by me. Now, focus on your forehead and draw a golden line from your forehead to your left foot. The golden line continues from your left foot to your right hand golden line continues from your right hand to your left hand, and from your left hand to your right foot. Try to hold that star. Concentrate on the thought. Strength in me. Strength in me. Good. Okay, you can open your eyes. While we were meditating, the dogs were, they were jiving on our vibes here. Good. So friends, I don't know if any of you could already feel something from that exercise, but I've worked with that exercise for quite some time, and it can definitely be a source of strength for life, vitality for life. Good. Okay. We can move to the final gift that I wanted to talk about. That is the gift of truth. How can we orientate our hearts to truth? Is there any such thing as truth? How can we orientate our hearts to truth and cultivate a sense for truth in this time of difficult untruths everywhere? You could even say lies everywhere, also in our own being. And this technique, I would say, has to do with also something that Steiner talks about a lot, and that connects with this image of Michael, the archangel Michael, that you often will see if you go to a Waldorf school or an Anthroposophical branch, meeting place or something. It's a very common image that you see, particularly because Rudolf Steiner had a connection with this spiritual being. But you often see Michael focusing on light, something is shining into his face, and at the same time he is taming darkness. He's not focusing on the darkness, he's focusing on the light. So in this sense, then the technique here is more trying not to battle untruthfulness head on by trying to focus on the darkness, but focus on the light, and through that cultivate more light in the darkness. Yeah. He also talks about this principle on how to know higher worlds, for example, which is one of his books, of how to deal with impatience, which sometimes I experience with my children. Impatience, he says, don't focus on impatience itself. Don't try to beat up the impatience or figure it out. But focus on a light-filled thought that then will indirectly transform the darkness. And the light-filled thought is, I will strive with all my might to strive for higher knowledge and wait patiently for what is for me to be bestowed on me. That's the thought that we have to think in order to transform in patience. So you don't focus on the darkness, you focus on the light in consciousness of the darkness, like Michael. So that principle also applies then to truth, I would suggest, to cultivating truth, focusing on how can we find ways to connect our hearts with truth rather than trying to solve all of the untruths. And one way that I felt inspired to share this mystery with you all tonight is to introduce a way of thinking about truth that's connected to the fourfold being of man. And this is a fundamental aspect of anthroposophy, of spiritual science, that we, our beings, and even reality is fourfold. And that is physical at the base, something called life or ether, etheric, the life sphere, the sphere of change and movement, the soul realm, or he calls also, uses a word astral body, astral realm, and the realm of the spirit, the realm of also he calls the I, or the ego. And for anthroposophy, the ego is something that needs transformation, but is also quite positive. In fact, the ego is the most important thing in all of evolution, because it is called to become the diamond from the coal. And not, as some other spiritual movements that are around very much today, not to get gotten rid of, but purified so that it can become a bearer of the divine. It's another very important difference. But back to truth. So I would suggest to you that there are different ways to experience truth, and the first one has to do more with the physical realm. This podium is here. It wobbles. And I know that because I have a pretty healthy sense of touch and my eyes are pretty good still. Yeah. The first way to cultivate truth is to really try to cultivate your senses and your sense for physical observation. The second realm of truth would be connected to the life realm. And that goes something like this. This has to do with everything that changes. So for example, right now, most of the leaves on the trees are still there. So I could say it's true that the trees have leaves on it, but that won't be true in a month. That will change. So there's also a level of truth that is constantly changing, and it depends on where we're at in a cycle to what we can recognize as true. So orientating our hearts towards the life sphere of the realm of truth, we have to be flexible and try to see in time and space what's true when. What about the soul realm? The soul realm, then we start to get into likes and dislikes. I think it's true that hamburgers are the best thing to eat. But Robert thinks chicken is the best. Or pesto pasta. Yeah? So what's true for me is not true for you. Yeah? This realm. Or the realm of the soul is also the realm of logic. All human beings have 2 legs and no feathers. the example Steiner gave one time. So someone brought in a chicken that was plucked. This must be a human being. Right, obviously that's not. But if you just had those two assumptions, then logically that's what you'd have to conclude. Obviously your assumptions are limited. But also the realm of logic, reasoning. I remember when I first discovered geometry. I was terrible I was a terrible student in high school, but I got geometry. It was so exciting to actually see and understand, finally, something my teacher was telling me. Oh, okay. Geometry was quite an experience for me. To understand through the mind, to experience that's true, that's correct. Soul level truth. But what about spirit level? Spirit level, and I want to stay on that for a little bit, and then we'll end and we'll have questions. But the spirit level of truth is connected to our, what we call our ego, our I. And this is something, the spirit level of truth is nothing that I can actually prove to you. Only eyes can have experiences. So for example, the experience that the spiritual world is made up of spiritual beings, I actually can't prove to you in a geometric formula or a mathematical proof. Only by experiencing that through your own eye can you come to know that for yourself. I remember my godfather who crossed the threshold recently. I told him after I was confirmed, I'm an atheist, and you can't prove to me God exists. And he said, yeah, you're right, Jonah. I can't prove to you God exists, but you can prove it to yourself. And I was too cruel to admit it, but that really affected me. And it like lit this fire. I've got to find God for myself. This is finding God for yourself is something only that can happen on the level of the I, truth of the I, that can't necessarily, I can't just transfer it to you. Like I can share with you that this thing is here. Only if you also have that experience yourself can we then share in an understanding. So there's four. There's four aspects of spirit truth. And the first one is, what did I write there? That it's a gift in the moment. First quality of spirit truth. It's something that you cannot have and carry around. It comes in the moment. Think of Amelia. Now think all the way back to our first story, Amelia. Was that a truth that I had that I then imparted to her because I'm this all-knowing priest? No. It came in the moment when we were both really living with that question. Why is this happening to me? Why isn't this going away, this cancer? And it came. So spirit truth, the first quality is that it comes as a gift. And we can try to be ready for it by also forgetting what we know sometimes. To be ready for what wants to be drop in this moment. Another aspect of that momentary truth is something a great thinker, a great speaker that I love, his name is Cornel West, grew up in Sacramento. He's an academic. He said, the condition for truth to arise is that suffering is allowed to speak. Amelia spoke, and truth came. And thank God we received it. So that's a very different understanding than I know what's true and I walk around and try to hammer you over the head with it. No. Truth comes in a moment with a particular context, particular moment, soul's there, something happens. That's spirit truth, the first quality. The second quality I want to share is not only is it a gift in the moment, but spirit truth is always transformational. You feel, when truth comes, different after it arrives. You feel new. You feel freer. You feel more yourself. Think of Bill Griffin. When this doctor said, you can listen, he had a new sense for life. He felt different. Amelia too. When our heart is gifted with spirit truth, we can know it's there because we're changed. We're liberated from our old selves in a new way. This transformational process, when we come into truth, always necessitates something where we also learn to let go of an old self and receive something new, where we feel more vitalized for our life. And third, truth, and this is particularly to spiritual science, Rudolf Steiner describes truth as feeling the harmony between multiple perspectives. He actually describes that there are always 12 points of view that are true at the same time. But, he says, truth in this context is the feeling of harmony between different true, even perhaps contradictory points of view. And there's a little exercise that I like to do, and that has to do with mathematics. To see 3 different mathematical truths, in a way, that are in a way contradictory, but can be in harmony. So, what is 1 plus 1? 2. Okay. That's easy. Now, think about, anybody play baseball when they're little? Little league? Yeah, me too. William? When I played, I liked to chew big old wad of bubble gum. Now imagine the little kids chewing a big old wad of bubble gum, and another kid's chewing a big old wad of bubble gum. And the one kid comes over to the other kid and he pulls it out, and he pulls his out, and then the one kid grabs his bubble gum, smashes it together, and chews the whole wad. So what is the mathematics there? 1 plus 1 is 1. Okay, think them both. Can you think them both? It's also true that 1 plus 1 is 2. And if you look at it from that perspective, 1 plus 1 is 1. Are you holding them both? Now, third one. Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody, maybe an intimate friend, and all all of a sudden, or maybe not so sudden, you start to feel like there's something bigger than just you two in this conversation? Something more than just you two speaking? I see some nods. Oh, good. Yeah? Sometimes it can happen that when we're in an intimate, deep conversation, all of a sudden we can feel there's something more than just us here. So do the math of that. 1 plus 1 is 3. 1 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 1 is 3. Now try to feel how the harmony between those three, even though they're in a way contradictory, Rudolf Steiner says that is the feeling of, that's truth, the feeling of the harmony of three equally true points of view. So spirit truth is also an experience of harmony, of being able to move between multiple true experiences, perspectives. And finally, dear friends, spirit truth has this quality not only of a momentary happening that I can't necessarily have and bang people over the head with it, but I have to wait at every moment to find the truth. Not only is truth something that when it touches us, transforms us, gifts us with new life, liberation, truth sets us free. It's also, spirit truth is a gift of learning to feel the harmony of multiple perspectives. And finally, the perspective of spiritual science, truth, like everything, is ultimately a being. Truth is a being. And you can think of Ralph's experience of this incredible love that he felt from this presence. It felt like his true home that he had been longing for his whole life. From the perspective of spiritual science, truth is actually a being. So, friends, spiritual science Anthroposophy is in reality a way. It's a way to cultivate deep meaning in life. It's also vitality itself. It's a way to find deep sources of life. And it's also a way to truth. You could even say anthroposophy is way, truth, life. So it's 8:30, and that's what I wanted to share with you. So coming down here, I was most excited about perhaps perhaps there are questions or new people to encounter. And I know from Robert that we are meant to now have a little bit of questioning time, even though it's quite hot. It's a nice sauna in here.
We're supposed to have some microphones. Grant, do we have microphones?
Do you have microphones?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that this time, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah.
Not in.
Well, you can yell.
Yell at the priest.
Yell at the priest. Yeah, perhaps there are one or two questions that we can share with us all. Yeah, Robert.
So, I mean, all of this is, of course, wonderful, but it is all so anthroposophically referenced. So how does someone who knows nothing about anthroposophy deal with these realities? And so they must be also available to other people without anthroposophy, be they the meaning, the burnout, and the truth.
Yeah. Did everybody hear Robert's question? I mean, I did work to try not to have too much anthroposophical lingo, but indeed, there is always, with any path, there is a kind of a lingo. But if you look at this, I think if we filled this hall with people and we asked the same question, where in your life have you grown the most? I think it's just a general reality that people, through crisis, grow the most. It's not an anthroposophical truth. I just saw a head nod that I've never seen before. So that also tells me something. So especially in the first example, the fact that we become more truly, we learn to be a better person through difficulties is simply a universal truth. It's just that anthroposophy has maybe some deeper perspectives on that. And there are plenty of people that practice different forms of meditation that also find life and vitality in that. And of course, hopefully everyone sleeps. And I would also argue, especially the way I described it, that the forms of spirit truth that I described, they're not limited to anthroposophical stuff. Truth as a happening in the moment, that's not anthroposophical lingo. Yeah. Does that help, Robert, or no?
Well, yeah, of course, those are truths. It's just that I'm looking or thinking in terms of how do people access those truths without the anthroposophic lingo and such. And that's the difficulty.
Well, I think it's in the examples, like for example, Ralph is not an anthroposophist. What was the second? Bill Blur wasn't an anthroposophist. Yeah. These are examples of everyday people who are transformed through life. Yeah. But Robert, you wanted to say something?
Just a comment. I think part of the reality is here that if we were to say, well, how will other people build a rocket and go to the moon if they don't have science? And we'd say, well, of course they can't. They have to have the science. This is a part of the reality of anthroposophy. Yes, human beings over many incarnations will stumble towards these truths and find them. But anthroposophy and the study of anthroposophy gives us the fast track. And boy, do we need it. So I think that the challenge is for the anthroposophists to find a way of talking to the rest of the world that deals with this category problem and this credibility problem.
Yeah.
And that's on us. It's
Yeah.
not on the world to say, it's on us to find a way to talk to people that they can hear.
Yeah.
When they're ready.
But there's also this quality, like you mentioned, that it's also, you've got to study a geometry book if you want to learn geometry. There's just a quality to that. You can't expect everyone to know how to meditate just naturally. You've got to learn how to meditate. You've got to study, you've got to work at it. You've got to choose a particular path. Yeah? That's a good point, Robert. This hand and then, I think, Grant. What was your name?
Adam,
Adam. Hi.
speaking of this growth through crisis. Using this perspective, how do you make the most of that growth? How do you consciously navigate that growth and know that
Yeah.
the benefit of that crisis is you're maxing out on it?
Yeah. You're maxing out on the benefit of the crisis. That's a very good question. Also, what's that? Oh, yeah, what is the question? Okay. The question is, how do you, if I'm right, how do you benefit the most? How do you maximize the benefit of learning to work with this truth, as we have described it, that through crisis, I become a better person. I get more connected with my real self. I find deeper and deeper experiences of being of love. How do I maximize that truth, so to speak? Maximize it. Well, I would say the first thing is that it's a kind of inner attitude of the everyday self. Cultivating the inner attitude that what comes to me in my life is for me, is actually my higher being coming to me. Kind of like the meditation we did. I'll regard everything around me as necessary. It's important for my being. So cultivating that attitude that actually when my colleague comes and gives me a lot of crap, that's actually important for me to meet and grow in and through. And maybe confront, or maybe not confront, maybe I'm being asked to bear something and not dismiss them because they don't think like me. So the whole attitude of what are you, oh life, what are you trying to teach me? This isn't a lingo thing. This is an inner attitude that actually Viktor Frankl found, not an anthroposophist, in a concentration camp. He found that the human soul has the capacity to understand new forms of meaning and meet life in a totally new way based on how I enter and see things. Yeah? So always asking, what are you trying to teach me? What is this what part of myself is this difficulty trying to bring to me anew? Those kinds of questions can be asked constantly. I got Grant, and then you, and then you, and then you, and then you. I don't know if I'm going to remember that, but at least we'll start here. Grant, and then you.
So I'll start with a very practical question or a comment, and I'd ask you to elaborate on it.
Yeah.
And that is that we're in the midst of the political milieu right now, and as I saw your presentations of truth, and especially the multiple perspectives of truth, it gave me a new way of negotiating these last 4 or 5 days, and everyone telling me their truths. So is that an example of something that the anthroposophical approach could assist the public discourse?
Well, I don't know how it would assist the public discourse, but it will, this type of understanding that actually there are multiple correct perspectives, but it doesn't mean that everything is relative either. And that truth is my capacity to feel the harmony of and move my own spirit to think different things, but not to say everything is true, because that's also not real. But to feel that harmony is a good way that your heart doesn't become hateful and fearful, and where you can be polarized. That's the big danger, I would say, is that we get polarized with wedge issues. This capacity protects the heart from being polarized into hate. Okay, I know, maybe that helps, I don't know. Sure.
So I want to ask a more philosophical question.
Okay.
If we are to regard has been necessary.
Mm.
And then comes into question how do we be good within those constructs, but that's
How do we
would take
wo-
hours, I'm sure.
What was the last part though? I missed it.
Well, okay, so if everything is in fact necessary, if we're going with that definition, then how do we be good when we know that horrible things are intended to happen? Why then do we feel the pull to be good at the end of the day if horrible things are meant to happen, in fact, all the time? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Mhm.
But I just asked like 4 questions, so pick whatever one you want to tackle.
It's super deep, super good question. It really also begs the question of the meaning of suffering and what is the relevance of goodness within a world of suffering. And I had a feeling that question would come because that exercise is very intense in that way, especially if you're in a very difficult situation in life. But my experience with that exercise is that it's meant to actually help us to learn to actually see clearly what's happening and learn to bear in a certain way the reality of suffering in the world, because it is, and the suffering in our lives. But then also there's that other part that says, I will do everything that is necessary for me to do. So from the perspective of this, it's not that suffering is happening and therefore I'm just resigned to all suffering in the world. But that suffering is a reality and I'm called to do what I can to bring more love, truth into the darkness.
But is all suffering a necessary reality?
No.
All of it?
No.
Okay,
If I go and bang my head against the wall,
that's unnecessary, right?
it's
So
unnecessary.
then how do we discern when we are actually being called to action versus when
We're not.
we're not?
Well, that's why the third line comes in. I will do everything that is necessary for me to do. See that? That's a discerning that's a discerning piece. What is necessary for me to do? It doesn't say I will do everything that should be done or everything. But it's calling up for me to start to have the organ to discern what is actually important for me to do. Sometimes I need to address certain sufferings. Sometimes if I address them, they get worse. Anyway, that's a much longer, I'm not sure if that helped, but that's a very deep, ultimately, a truth from the perspective of spiritual science is that the being of love is actually bearing right now all the suffering in the world. And when we can learn to get closer to that, we can also learn that. Yeah?
So the title of the lecture is Awakening the Gifted Heart. And you talked about 3 gifts, 3 beautiful gifts. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit more about how these gifts actually keep the heart awakened and opens the heart. You kind of touch based on truth, how truth can actually bring up
Yeah.
that awakening and
Yeah.
openness.
Yeah.
I
Good. Okay. I'll try to. So everyone, she asks.
Could you repeat?
Yes, she asks. Your title is about awakening the heart, and she's wondering how do these gifts? We talked about 3 gifts. How do these gifts actually awaken the heart, right? And keep. Right. Well, yeah. Perhaps I didn't make that super clear. Although I wanted to. But maybe I can explain it this way, that the spirit or the self in Anthroposophy, the self has its seat in the heart. So when my own self awakens to new meaning, new vitality, and I learn to have agency in those realms, when myself is able to orientate it to truth, itself to truth, and be more and more able to orientate myself to the realities of truth on a spirit level, that, for spiritual science, is also my heart. Because the understanding is that my I has its home, my I has its home in the heart. So perhaps I didn't make that clear, but there you go. So the self and the heart and the blood that also is connected to the self is also the heart. Yeah? Sir?
Yeah, my question's about parenting.
Oh.
I was just wondering if there's any specific resource or, I guess, connection to bring you vitality, to support you in being a guidance counselor to your kids and also a parent to your kids.
Oh. It's funny because I just got this flash of just feeling the inadequacy. I find it very challenging being a father. 3 daughters, I love them. But one of the interesting thing is, what I'll first say is that I would say parenting is a path of initiation in itself. You want to have some crises and just have kids. They will become your guides to learning what being broken open means. Having to take steps and patience and growth and things that you would have never imagined. So yeah, I mean the best guide is to have them. And then go for it. But you know what, there's lots of people, probably Dr. McAllister can answer that question better. There's lots of people that know a lot more about parenting than me. Beth, right there. Melanie. So I don't know if that helps, but for now. Yeah, John.
Is it possible for us to, because that's an individual model, and I understand why. Is it possible for us to think in terms of this experience happening to a group, to a people? And could you maybe even speculate on what that would mean?
So the question is, this is an individual model. He asked, is it possible for a group or a people or a nation or some kind of, group to have this type of challenge, be an awakener of deeper and deeper levels of meaning? I would say for sure. I would say actually the anthroposophical group, the society, and all of its daughters are in the crisis right now. In that, I would say the higher being of Anthroposophy is sending us difficulties, particular difficulties, in order to challenge us to become new, to renew ourselves at every level. Medicine, education, even Christian community, what? Farming. There's a certain kind of spiritual substance that we've been feeding on for a long time, from 1925 when it was all, or 1923 when it was all started. But now it feels like after these 100 years that there has to be a renewed orientation to this spiritual being of Anthroposophia. And that we're receiving certain crises in order to help us awaken to those new sources. I don't know if you would agree, my friends, but it seems to me.
Seems to me that the whole world is at the present in crisis. We're asking ourselves, are we going to exist?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yes, even though the humanity is in a way at a crisis point. And the hope is that it comes to find in that challenge a deeper relationship with its truer being. Right? I mean, there's no anthroposophical lingo there. Yeah. Someone else?
Well, I was just going to add on to that, I think we're at a time where it's really about discovering who we are internally by ourselves. So discovering the I, that spark of the ego. If you think about, I think Steiner talks about that in one of the lectures, how when it came to the time of Archangel Michael, and how it was when people developed their cognitive capacities that really brought all this innovation and technology into it, but also made us feel separate from the group somewhat. If you think about like back later, hundreds or thousands years ago, people identified a lot more with a group. If you were, to be like cast out of your society was like the worst sin that could happen to happen to someone. But I think today with those we're losing some of those group capacities, but that's kind of needed because in order to develop these higher, I guess you can call them etheric powers or whatnot, to develop our soul further, it's about focusing on yourself and discovering yourself and pushing that further in order to reach that.
Yes, that's a very good point. So he's saying that it's really apropos at this time to really have growth be about yourself. And yet, some of the more, even though this seems simple, it's actually quite an advanced anthroposophical concept that my I is both in the spiritual world and a part of it is in my heart. And that my truer being is actually outside me, coming towards me in my life. And Rudolf Steiner says that more and more there will come a time, and it's happening now, when I will find more of myself in the others that I encounter than anything in my skin. This is what is preparing us for what's called the sixth epoch. That my I is actually an illusion that myself is here. He says, my I is now more and more going to come to me from the other people that I encounter. And this gets into a deep mystery of the human I, that it's not just about developing this thing here, it's about learning to see self in the world. Yeah? So that's another element. It's not to say that that's untrue, but there's a further development of the self that starts to say in just regular lingo, when I encounter you, I'm encountering more of my I than anything in here. That's a challenge. That also connects with the gospel, by the way, Matthew, where he says, when I was in prison, you came to visit me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. That our highest being, which is actually in this being of love, is living more in the other. That's for the future that we have to start practicing now. One more, maybe, or yeah, Jesse, nice to see you.
See you. I was recently reading Knowledge of Higher Worlds, Chapter 1, which talks about the path of devotion, and then it really struck me this time reading through when he talks about the first rule.
Mm.
And Steiner doesn't talk about rules very often. It's not a rule-based path, but he says the first rule is this daily review. That this is something that needs to be really considered as top drawer as the first thing, the first practice that needs to be followed. I was kind of surprised you didn't mention that as a way to gear into the spiritual world, but you reminded me when you're saying that it's through the other, through the outer circumstances that we get a sense of ourselves. And that's really what's going on in the daily review. You go in and you bring up those pictures of your encounters. Maybe it'd be worth doing a little touching on that.
Yeah, the Ruksha. Probably most of you know about that. It's the exercise is to go over your day, sometimes backwards, and just try to see very objectively, almost like you're looking at yourself from on top of a mountain or something, the events, and just to observe them. Yeah, and it starts to get the sense that in my life, in others, in encounters, I start to experience my being. But it also practices and strengthens what you could call the witness self, which is in a way this lower I that disentangles itself from all of its feelings, thoughts, will impulses, and is able to just behold and witness its own being and others, and isn't reactive to everything. And that witness I is the basis for then learning to strengthen the self to go into these higher realms, for sure. Good thought.
So I'd like to let you stop.
Good.
Because,
Thank
always,
you.
We just had a master class. When we assembled this lecture series, we invited 3 of the best anthroposophists that are available to us. We didn't choose to have an introduction to anthroposophy, to answer the simple questions, and then 3 years later, answer the questions that arose tonight. We asked for 3 excellent speakers. The last time the speaker told us what an initiate can do in a realm like architecture. What an amazing accomplishment Rudolf Steiner did in one very small part of his life. Today we heard what all of anthroposophy, so much of it is implied tonight, can do to help us navigate this difficult world. And in 1 month, we hear again about how anthroposophy can offer us a perspective that doesn't conflict with the modern materialistic world, but expands upon it. So these are 3 rather advanced approaches to anthroposophy. Many of us here are ready and eager. Others are coming in at a rather dynamic spot, and you're welcome, and we welcome your questions. Realize, though, that this is not introduction to untruthfulness. This is a master class in untruthfulness. I want to thank Jonah very much for doing this for us. Thank you.
I highly recommend coming next time for Dr. Kenneth McAllister's talk. It should be very...
On November 21st, same place, same time. We have some refreshments. We're happy to have conversation for a while before we're kicked out. Thank you very much.